Good afternoon, everybody. Now, with me, Mr. Kunal Basu, who needs no introduction. Those who have already heard of him yesterday, they are already aware. Besides that, even if before that, you people are all aware of Kunal Basu. 6 or 7 years before, while I was in JLF entrance gate, Kunal and Madam Susmita Basu were passing. They were returning to their place. There we met. Then it started our friendship, began from that day. Over these years, Mr. Kunal Basu has been established as one of the finest Indian writer in English in fiction, and he has been widely read, translated, discussed, debated, not only in India, around the world. So in this session, I will have some common questions to Kunal. I am privileged, rather I should say, to interview Mr. Kunal Basu. Kunal, I just want to ask you the beginning question that you yesterday revealed that you had a connection with Odisha also, and your mother was in Athaghat. Could you just explain a bit what is that?
Thank you, Manu, for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming. It's a very hot day outside, so it probably feels more pleasant inside, right? You see, I've grown up with stories of Odisha from my mother. And the reason is, my mother's father was an officer in the British administration of Bengal and other regions, other provinces. And every 5 or 6 years, he used to get transferred. So he was in what we now know as Bangladesh. He was in Bihar. But in my mother's formative years, he was posted in Atkar. And my mother was absolutely fluent in Odia. Totally fluent in Odia. And sometimes I remember when I was young, she would start speaking to us and then suddenly lapse into Odia. Speak to us in Bangla, then suddenly lapse into Odia. And of course, these are two sister languages. Okay. And so I've grown up with stories of Atkar. I've grown up with stories of all parts of Odia. But as I mentioned yesterday, it's my great misfortune that I didn't learn Odia from her. So that's my story of Atkar. Okay. I have never visited. I'm told it is in Cuttack district. And I must go. Monu, you have to invite me back so I can only go to Atkar. Absolutely.
Okay. Kunal, your parents were communist. Your mother was a writer, father was a publisher, and naturally you might have grown with the books from your childhood. You yourself was also one SFI leader. Besides that, then you did your mechanical engineering. You worked in advertising. You had some part-time journalism also. Now you are a professor in Oxford University in marketing strategy. How is the journey throughout all these years?
You know, when we novelists write a character, okay, a character who grows up from childhood and reaches adult age, we try to pull together some common links. This is what the person did as a child, and then how this person developed into a profession, and then into other professions, and so on and so forth. Monu, my life makes no sense on paper. My life makes no sense on paper. Because it was never directed by a particular strategy or goal. Okay? I fell into doing lots of things, and I'm not going to bore you and the audience with these details, but my biggest problem was I was a good student. In other words, I did well in subjects that I had no love for. So as a child, I hated mathematics, but I got high marks in mathematics. Okay? Now, this is a very, very bad problem to have, because when you're a child and your exam marks and your exam performance creates an ecosystem around you. Then people say, oh, you should study science. Okay? I disliked science as subjects. But I did well, again. And then when I did well in my university years, and there are lots of people here who are my vintage or maybe younger, then the only choice for a middle-class Indian boy was to study engineering or medicine or be unemployed. Okay? And as a young person in a middle-class Indian home, I was not outside of that ambit. So I studied engineering without any love for engineering. And you would think that the journey would end after I graduated. But it didn't. I got a scholarship from a top university in America to do a master's. Okay? And I told myself, look, nobody will pay me to travel around this world. But with this scholarship, if I do a master's in engineering, then I can travel around the world at the university's expense. So I went to do a master's. Made no sense. I was not interested in doing a master's. But I did it in 9 months. Okay? And then when I returned to India after that, that's when crisis struck. What am I going to do with my life? I'm not interested in science. I'm not interested in engineering. I've got 2 degrees in engineering. What am I going to do? And in those days, in the 80s, there were not too many career options open to somebody who's interested in the arts. I actually, Manu, never wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an artist. Visual artist. That was my ambition and dream. And I wanted to be an actor. So I acted in a couple of Mrinal Sen films, and I got a few role offers in Bombay, but I could not identify myself singing and dancing around a tree. Okay? Which was more or less Bombay films in the 80s. Okay? And at that juncture, the option of doing a PhD opened up in the US in the area of management studies. And I thought, well, maybe this is what I need to do, because if I became a professor, then I would be my own boss. At least in the West, that is the case. And if I choose a career which is the least disruptive of the arts, all careers are disruptive of the arts, but the least disruptive of the arts, then maybe I can really give vent to my passion, which by then had become writing. So that's what I did. Okay. Did a PhD, worked for a top university in Canada, McGill University, came to Oxford 22 years back, and it gave me the luxury of time which an author needs in order to write. Now, if you were to write all of this journey up, it would make no sense. And it doesn't make much sense to me now. But that's my life.
Okay. You are talking about your taking a part as a child artist in cinemas and in Satyajit Ray or Mrinal Sen's cinema. So it struck to my mind because I have about 2 years before I had published Soumitra Chatterjee's Bengali poems into English. Unfortunately, the day it reached, he had to rush to the hospital and he never returned from that place. Can you just tell, as a child artist, how was your experience with Soumitra Da?
Yeah, I will tell you. So, this was a role in a film called Punoshcho by Mrinal Sen, directed by Mrinal Sen. I was a very naughty boy. Okay? So, in this huge set in Kolkata, dark, lights like this all around, okay? I would vanish at the time of shooting. I would run around, I would hide somewhere, and Mrinal Sen, who I called Mrinal Kaka, Mrinal Kaka, was, would always search for me, and he was very troubled. Where is this boy? Where is this boy, And I still remember this, that he called me over and said, I want to introduce you to somebody. It was dark inside the studio, and there was a gentleman wearing a black suit, white shirt and a tie. And he was the most handsome man I've ever seen in my life. That was Soumitra Chattopadhyay. And he acted as my father in that film. So much later, whenever I've met him many times, whenever I'd meet Soumitra Chattopadhyay, I would say, do you remember that you had acted as my father? And he would say, oh my God, am I that old?
Well, Kunal, when we are talking about cinema, immediately it comes to my mind about your story which has been made by Aparna Sen, that My Japanese Wife. Yeah. Can you just tell something about that? How did it happen? Because I have seen that cinema also.
Yeah, it happened in a very mysterious way. I mean, the story and the film both happened in a very mysterious way. And I don't know whether any of you read The Japanese Wife, but it's a story of a Sundarbans school teacher who lives in the Sundarbans, who teaches mathematics, who falls in love with a young Japanese woman, and because they become pen pals. They write letters to each other, and they become pen friends. And they keep writing letters, and at one time, he decides to propose to her on a letter. And she accepts. So they become married through letters. They've never met in their lives. They've never met before. Okay? And they remain married for 20 years without ever casting eyes on each other. But they live, so to speak, as a married couple. Okay? She writes to him and saying, you're spending too much money, you must be careful. Okay? Just like, a wife would to her husband. And he would write back saying, you're not taking care of your health. I warned you, you must go see a doctor right away. Okay? So they bicker like an old couple, but they've never met in their lives. And that is called, the story is called The Japanese Wife. And I fell upon this idea very, very accidentally. You mentioned about my political past. Yes, in the 70s, I was a political activist from the left. I was not interested in literature, I was interested in the revolution. And I was traveling in a part of Bengal, a rural part of Bengal, and was waiting to catch a ferry. And a friend of mine said, hey, Kunal, look at that man. And there was this portly man, middle-aged, carrying an umbrella, wearing a dhoti. And he said, he's a school teacher. Do you know? He has a Japanese wife. Now, in a city, in a big city, you might find people who have foreign spouses. But in the Sundarbans, a school teacher with a Japanese wife, my big advantage and great good fortune was that I did not ask any follow-up questions to my friend. I did not ask him, how? Does he speak Japanese? how did they meet? Has he ever been to Japan? Does his wife ever come to the Sundarbans? Do they have children? What language do they speak? I never asked a single question, my friend. And 25 years later, on a night of snowstorm in Montreal, where we then lived, I sat at my desk and wrote the story of The Japanese Wife, which tells you that the human mind is a very complex mechanism. And I don't know how that single incident 25 years ago sparked this very unusual story, which when Aparna Sen, I told her the story, she said, have you sold this story to anybody? I said, no. Haven't sold it to any film director. She said, don't, because I'm going to make a film out of this. And I said, oh, yes. Film people always say these things, but they never really do it. And I totally forgot about it. And I was passing through Kolkata because my mum lived in Kolkata. And then she called me up and said, Kunal, you must sell me rights. Otherwise, the producer is not going to release funds. I said, oh. That's when I knew that the film was happening. So 2 sets of strange coincidences led to the story and the film.
You're writing novels on a historical subjects. Perhaps after Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, you are the first novelist in Bengal who is writing on the historical themes.
That's actually not true. In Bengal, there's a long tradition in Bangla of historical fiction. So Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay is one, Sharadindu is another, Ramesh Chandra Majumdar is another. And I've grown up reading all these historical novels in Bangla, and I was mesmerized by them. I'm only second to Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay in one way, that Bankim was the first Bengali to have written full-length novels in two languages.
English and Bengali.
First in English, first novel in English, and then many novels in Bangla. But after him, no novelist in Bengal has written full-length novels in two languages. And I followed him, but many years later.
Well, Bankim was influenced by Walter Scott. Who is your inspirer? By whom you have been influenced, if you would ask me that question?
Many, Manu. Okay. So I've been very fortunate growing up, as you said in the beginning, in a house full of books. To my left was Tolstoy, to my right was Tagore. Okay. And so there were the great classics in our home. And the love for reading was instilled in me and as well as my sister from a very early age. So I cannot even begin to list the authors that I've been influenced by. But if you think about historical fiction, I was certainly influenced by Dickens, who I read voraciously. In fact, I first read Dickens in Bangla translation. I was a kid and I read his stuff in Bangla. So for a long period of time, I thought Charles Dickens was a Bengali. And when I grew, I said, oh, so he's not a Bengali? He said, no, you must read him in English. My mom said, you must read him in English. Okay. So Dickens certainly, in Bangla, definitely Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Sharadindu and others. So the whole sort of the repository of historical novels I was exposed to from a very early age.
After being earning the reputation of being a English novelist, suddenly you started writing your novels in Bengali. What is the reason behind it? How it happened?
Yesterday, one of your guests here, the very esteemed author and scholar Rishikesh Malik, was talking about writing in one's mother tongue. I'd never considered myself as an author writing in English because I'd grown up writing and reading mostly in Bangla. And like most young men and women in university, I'd started by writing poetry, very bad poetry. I disliked my poetry, okay, in Bangla. And we wrote about romance and revolution, mostly. Now, romance happened, but revolution never happened, okay? But when I started writing in English and I wrote a considerable period of time in English, I continued to be a practitioner of Bangla, always speaking in Bangla at home, writing in Bangla, and reading and keeping up with Bangla literature and Bangla fiction. And we lived in Montreal, which is French Canada, Quebec. And the Quebecois would always say that we are the most bilingual people on earth, French and English. And I would argue with them. I said, no, you're wrong. We Indians are the most bilingual and sometimes trilingual people on earth. Okay? Because we not only speak, read, and write in two different languages, for me, in my case, Bangla and English, but we have two literary streams flowing within us. And we can jump from one to the other without having to seek permission. Now, I've said this many times to lots of people, and then it struck me. Hey, you have never written a novel in Bangla. Okay, you're making all these tall claims, but you've never written a novel in Bangla. Now, for me always, for both writing in English and Bangla, my starting point is a story. I have to think of a story which is arresting enough for me, which keeps me awake at night, so to speak, in order to write it. And very fortunately, in 2015, suddenly I thought of this story, which then I wrote as a novel called Robi Shankar, Robi-Shankar. It's about two people, Robi, an ex-Naxalite, and Shankar, the police officer who had arrested him in the 70s and tortured him in jail. But the story happens 20 years later when the roles are reversed. when Shankar is a retired police employee, leading his life on a small, meager pension. And Robi, after his stint as an Naxalite, has gone abroad, studied medicine, and become a hotshot doctor, making lots of money, a pillar of society. And he's come back to Kolkata to practice. And they meet 25 years later when the power balance has shifted the other way. Okay? And this novel explores what happens when ex-combatants meet under very different situations and circumstances of life. So I thought of the story and I said, this will be my first novel in Bangla. It was published in 2016 by Ananda Publishers. It was shortlisted for the Ananda Puruskar. And since then, I've written 3 others, one of which you, Manu, you have translated into Oriya and published as Tejas.
Not translated. Translated is by somebody and I have published it. Thank you. My next question on your novel, the Kolkata. Kolkata, exactly, you have written there. 2 questions about that Kolkata. About the cover. How it happened, such a wonderful cover that it mesmerizes most of the times to me. Second question is that you have dealt with the all places of Kolkata city, including the life of the people staying in the red light area. How did you manage did you have any research about that?
Yeah, let me answer the second question first, and then I'll come to the question of the cover.
Okay.
Calcutta was a challenging novel for me to write, and in many ways a very satisfying novel for me to write. You see, when people talk about Kolkata, or Calcutta as it used to be called, people think that it's a Bengali city. Yeah? At its core, it's Bengali, and then there are non-Bengalis who also live in that city. But it's actually factually wrong. Okay? 57% of Kolkata's inhabitants are non-Bengalis. Okay? And because it's a metropolis, it has attracted, like all other metropolises, people from different parts of the country. Okay? Whereas Bengali authors have focused on the middle-class intelligentsia of Bengal. Okay? And I was not comfortable with that. Because for me, I need to discover the unfamiliar within the familiar. Okay? I was born and raised in Kolkata, so I'm very much a part of the Bengali milieu of Kolkata. But for me, that milieu is not exciting. It's familiar. It's too familiar. I wanted to discover the unfamiliar in Kolkata. And it happened to me again through an accidental encounter. Most stories, Manu, are born by, through small incidents that you overhear somebody saying something. Or you are sitting in a train station and you see a scene unfold in front of your eyes. Or you read a report in the newspaper and you say, what if this happened? And that what if leads to a story. So the trigger point for Kolkata for me was walking around the streets of Kolkata at night, which I do. I avoid traveling in a car. I walk wherever I have to go, and if it's too far, I take an Uber. So I was walking around a certain part of Kolkata, and I saw these young men sitting on motorcycles, okay, smelling of cologne, very well dressed, gold chain, expensive watch. I was thinking, who are these people? Who are they? So there was a juice bar nearby. And I went in and I sat down and I asked this juice bar owner, "ये लोग क्या करते हैं यहाँ पे?" And he said, वो जो tourist यहाँ पे आते हैं, foreign tourist, उसको कुछ सेवा लगे तो उसको help करते. And it's a place where a lot of backpacking Western tourists come and stay. I said, किस तरफ के सेवा? So he said, if they want to go to, say, the Dakhineshwar temple or to Shantiniketan, they act as tour guides. I said, ठीक है. और दूसरा क्या करते हैं इन लोग? He said, well, maybe drugs could lage to. So I understood that. They supply drugs to some people. और क्या करते हैं? और क्या सेवा? And he looked at me in a very meaningful way. और ये जो लड़की लोग आती है ना, और दूसरा कुछ सेवा लगे तो. And he stopped there. And I knew that there was a story. They were male prostitutes. They were gigolos. Now, I've grown up in Kolkata. I never knew that there is a subculture like this. Okay? And I said, I need to find the story. And for a year and a half, I tailed like a detective the male prostitutes, the gigolos. And it's very hard to make contact. They don't want to talk, let alone give an interview. And I wanted to find out not simply about their work, but about their homes. Most of their families don't know this is what they do. Many of them are married, and their wives don't know. So I wanted to find out everything about their life, where they live, what are their aspirations, what do they want to do later in life. Is this a temporary thing? Is there really their chosen profession? So it took me about 2 years to research them, and the reason I call the novel Calcutta is most of them come from what we believe are the fringes of society. But actually to them, we are the fringes of society. Okay, so that was the origin of Calcutta. And the jacket, so I was very fortunate to have worked with a jacket designer called Pinaki De, who has been to your festival before.
Yeah.
And I'm very finicky about jackets. I'm obsessive about jackets. And if I don't like a jacket, I'll tell the publisher, don't publish this novel. Okay. Again, I'm a failed artist, you see. I wanted to be an artist. So I want to see the jacket reflect that aspect of myself. And Pinaki and I would have long discussions. He would come up with 7, 8, 9 options. And I would say, Pinaki, this is not working. And in that jacket, if you have seen the cover, you will see is this one salient image of a being whose head is that of a dog and the body is that of a man, kneeling on the ground. Face of a dog, the body of a man. Okay? And the thinking behind that was, you know, when you walk at night through the streets and you see stray dogs, you're afraid of them, right? They might bark, they may chase you, they may bite you. The dogs are also afraid of you. That you can pick up a rock and throw at them. So the notion was, this is what we have done to each other in society. We are afraid of each other. We coexist in this space, but we have turned the other into their canine varieties. We are afraid of them, they are afraid of us. And Pinaki came up with a really iconic jacket, which subsequently won the Best Jacket Award at the Oxford Book Cover Prize.
Well, I just want to ask in this another question that you had once told me that how this our poet, what is his name, Bengali best poet, Sunilda has helped you getting help to research about,
Yeah, when I thought of the story of Calcutta, it appeared in my mind, and I said, oh, okay, so this is how I'm going to go about writing it. My biggest challenge was, now how do I meet a gigolo? You know, we normal people don't usually know individuals in that profession. So Shunil Gangopadhyay, who I knew, I went to him and said, can you help me? Can you put me in touch with a senior police officer? See, I don't live in Kolkata, so I don't have many of these connections and contacts that a lot of people do. And I said, can you introduce me? And he being a writer, he immediately understood. He said, yeah, no problem. And he called the Commissioner of Police of Kolkata and he said, Kunal wants to see you. It's not a criminal case. Okay? It's not a criminal case. He wants to see you because you can give him some information. So I walked into the headquarters, the police headquarters of Kolkata. Nobody checked me. There was no surveillance. I walked into his office. It's an old Raj-era office, huge desk. He offered me very good Darjeeling tea and he said, how can I help you, Mr. Basu? And he had read some of my books, so he knew that I was an author. How can I help you? And the first thing that I told him is, I'm looking for a few gigolos. And to his credit, to his great credit, he did not bat an eyelid. He said, it's a bit difficult because in the red light area, that's where the women sex workers are, but the men sex workers don't inhabit a particular area. They contact their clients through WhatsApp and all of these kinds of things. But I think I can help you. And he put me in touch with somebody, and then somebody, then somebody, then somebody, and eventually I reached my target.
Kunal, since last 50 years, Indian novel writing has just come of age. And how do you think it is been accepted, yeah, responded by the Britishers where you are working in Oxford since? How do you like the Indian writers in English, especially fiction?
You know, it's a mixed bag, if I have to be honest. There is greater awareness, there's greater interest among readers in the United Kingdom and the publishing industry in the United Kingdom about Indian writing in English. There is. From the time I started, my first novel came out in 2001 to now, so over 20 years, the publishing industry knows us. Okay? It's not that we have come from the Mars and suddenly started writing in English. Okay? So they know who we are. And in that respect, there is a kind of acceptance. And certainly many authors of Indian origin have had their works published in English from the United Kingdom and America and all different kinds of places. But there's a stereotype about India that inhabits their mind. What makes an Indian novel? If you write that kind of an Indian novel, your chances of being accepted and chances of being discussed is much more. Now, what is that stereotype? The stereotype is Indians will write about families. They write about joint families. They write about ripe green mangoes and tamarind. They'll describe the smell of jasmine floating in the air. Do you see what I'm getting at? Yeah? So a romanticized, very Orientalist view of India tends to dominate. Now there's another stereotype of India which is also prevalent. And that other stereotype is, we are loud people. We are picaresque. We are colorful. We are not to be trusted. Okay? We may cheat you. Okay? And there's criminality somewhere in our DNA. And therefore, ribald novels, the novel that comes to my mind, White Tiger, okay, and stuff like that fits into the stereotype of the United Kingdom, of the editors of the UK. They say, India, okay, so, Slumdog Millionaire, rough and dirty, loud music, Bollywood, and characters which are sort of, drawn in that broad brush, but not the subtlety, the subterranean, the detailing of life and characters that you might find among authors who are white. So if you fit those two stereotypes, then your chances of acceptance are higher. If you don't, you may not have such a sympathetic reading.
Now about to the Tejaswini and Sabnam, which I have published in Odia. Why Iraq? You choose the Iraq to tell that story.
There is actually a very curious tale why I wrote this novel. So about 4 years back, I had a phone call from a film producer in Bombay and said, Mr. Basu, we want you to write a novel for a story for us, made into a film. And they also prescribed the topic. It has to be about human trafficking. I said, no. I don't write fiction to order. You have called the wrong person. Okay? I write my books. If somebody likes to make a film out of it, great. If they don't, I don't care. Okay? Now, after I put the phone down, I said, maybe I shouldn't have been too hasty. Because we all read stories, horrible stories of human trafficking in newspapers, right? And we are outraged. But I, as an author, I don't have any access into that world. I don't know really what goes around. I've never met a trafficker in my life. I've never met somebody who's been rescued after having been trafficked. What is that experience of being trafficked? That horrible, disgusting, primitive, barbaric experience of being trafficked. I don't know anything like this, about this. So I called this guy back. I said, look, I'm not making any commitments, but if I do want to write this story, can you organize to take me to places where I would meet traffickers, trafficked people, women who've been rescued? Say, yeah, no problem. And they were true to their word. And they took help of an NGO, and one fine morning, I drove out from our residence in Kolkata to South Bengal, to a village, armed with, a recorder, my pad and pen, all the stuff that we writers carry when we want to do research. And they took me inside a village, in a small abandoned school building. And inside the school building, there were 14 little girls. I'll call them little girls, but because their age varied from about 15 to 22. They'd all been rescued, fortunately, after having been trafficked. 14 pairs of eyes looked back at me. And I couldn't ask a single question. The utter tragedy, the utter horror that they'd experienced was in their eyes. Okay. And they all coalesced together into one pair of eyes who, in my mind, became Shabnam. Okay. And just as I was leaving, when I was able to recover my voice, I called one of these and I said in Bangla, Ma, tumi kothay giyechile? Where were you taken? And she looked at me and says, Arab. I knew she had been trafficked to the Middle East, but she didn't know which country. Okay. So I came back, and I obviously didn't write the story for the film people. I did not. Okay. But in my mind, I tried to imagine a little girl from a village in South Bengal, lured and trafficked and sent to the Middle East where a war was raging. Saddam Hussein had just been killed, but the war was still raging with American troops, all kinds of combatants, and I imagined her there. And I wanted to give her a companion. And I said, who would she meet? She would meet another Indian woman who's come from a completely different background, a CNN journalist. Okay. A young woman who was adopted, called Tejoshini, who was adopted from Bengal, taken to America as a young child, and raised by very sympathetic parents, and she becomes a very confident, a very accomplished young woman, gone to the best of universities. And then she comes to cover the war in Iraq. Who does she meet? She meets a fellow Indian girl who has been trafficked and is now entertaining the American Marines in their barracks. So these two women find each other, and the story emerges from there. Tejoshini or Shabnam.
Thank you. My next question is about In an Ideal World, the last book which has been published only, I think, 2 weeks back. That story reminds me about a happening that stirred total the nation. And the source is JNU. Did that incident inspire you to write that story?
No, I know the incident that you're mentioning. It's Najib Ahmed. Najib Ahmed is a young JNU student who in 2016 was abducted from the college university campus, and he's not been found yet. There's a big student movement in JNU as well as other universities around the country, which tried to bring this abduction to the notice of authorities, and demanded that the Vice-Chancellor of JNU and the police and authorities find Najib Ahmed. His poor mother came from a village and went around banging on doors looking for her son, but he's not found still. Okay? There is a shadow of this experience, this event in my novel, but it was not inspired by it. It was inspired by something else. You see, I spent a very long time in India in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic. I couldn't return to the UK because there were all kinds of travel restrictions and there was no vaccine and so on and so forth. And as we were all traumatized by the pandemic, I was equally, if not more, traumatized by what was happening to my country. The complete outpouring of hate between and the two rival ideologies of secular, pluralistic India that I've grown up in, as opposed to the Hindu Rashtra, which is gaining ascendancy in the last few years. And it's not simply a political matter, not simply a BJP or a Congress or a TMC or AAP or anything like that. The rise of these two ideologies is splitting the heart of India into two. It is invading our soul. And as a result, families, friends, communities are beginning to distrust each other and be suspicious of each other and sort of going against each other in very abusive ways. You just have to read social media to get a flavor for that. Everyday diatribes. You just have to watch television news to see what we Indians are saying and doing to each other. Okay? No matter which part of the ideological spectrum you come from. And this troubled me deeply. Okay? We have a history of partition in this country. 1947. Okay? I wasn't born then. But we collectively carry the memory of that partition, that bloody partition even today. And what is happening in our country is the prelude to another cataclysmic event which will not leave anybody untouched. So that was my starting point. And I said, I want to write a story, and the story came to me organically. Of parents who are secular, liberal parents. The man works as a branch manager in a bank. Could be HDFC, ICICI, Axis, anything. And that's Joy. And Joy's wife, Rohini, is the head teacher or principal of a private school. Okay. They read books. They may come to literary festivals that Manu organizes. They see theater. They've got friends. They believe and they live the life of secular, pluralistic. They don't worry about caste. They don't worry about religion. They are professionals in the city. Their only son, Vivek, who they call Bobby, has gone to study computer science, first-year computer science students in a neighboring state. Could be Jharkhand, could be Bihar. Okay? When Joy and Rohini find out that their son has become an extreme nationalist, a leader, student leader, and not only that, he is implicated in the disappearance of a young Muslim student from his campus. And this comes to Joy and Rohini as a shock. Two things. How could our son, believe in such a radically different ideology to us? What did we do wrong? Did we do the right things? Are we responsible? What happened to him? And the second shock is, if he is indeed implicated in that kidnapping of a boy, another student who's still missing, then he's a criminal. And even if the police doesn't persecute him, we have to live our entire life with the knowledge that our son has committed a heinous crime. So the rival ideologies are no longer slogans given by politicians in the ballot box. The rival ideologies have invaded the home of an ordinary family of Indians. And so the parents said, look, we will engage in the investigation. Joy and Rohini set out for this college town to find the truth about their son, the truth about these ideologies, the truth about the disappeared boy. Okay? And in the process, they discover the truth about India.
Is it the reason you have written that about this book is a fractured land and a fractured heart?
That's what I believe, unfortunately, Manu, is that, when we were growing up in India, certainly there were different points of view, different political points of view. I experienced emergency. Okay? There were differences of opinion in terms of ideologies, all kinds of things. Okay? But deep down and fundamentally, at least that's my view, deep down and fundamentally, we believe that, we are all inhabitants of this nation. Okay? Horrible things happened. The 84 Sikh riots happened. Okay? But it never brought into question, at least not in my mind, in the mind of majority of Indians, that this nation could actually be fractured on the basis of religion or fractured on the basis of other things. Whereas the nation that we have now, that's a real possibility. Okay? So I feel that somehow it has impacted and created a deep rupture in our souls, which is far more dangerous, which is far more problematic, which is far more of a tragedy than any party winning an election and defeating any other party. Frankly, I don't care. You may vote for one party, you may vote for another party, but if fundamentally we agree to talk to each other, discuss our differences, and coexist in the nation, then we would have fulfilled our promise as fellow citizens. But that's what is being increasingly brought into question in the current temperament?
Well, before winding up, my last question would be that do you have any plan to write any novel on this corona or COVID pandemic situation?
No, I've been asked this question before. At least not immediately. As I mentioned earlier, when I begin to write a novel, I do not begin with a theme. I don't say, okay, here is a topic, here's a theme which is important, I should write a novel about that. Okay. I begin to write only when a story somehow appears in my mind. So to give you an example, my agent in London and my publisher in the UK, for many years have said, Kunal, you're an Indian, grew up in contemporary Indian, you grew up in Kolkata, why don't you write a Kolkata novel? I said, look, I can't because I haven't thought of a Kolkata story. And I only wrote Kolkata, my first novel set in contemporary Kolkata, only because that story appeared in my mind. The strange encounter with these boys sitting on motorcycles happened. Okay. So the pandemic has not yet created an unique story in my mind. I have written a story, yet unpublished, about migrant workers in the context of the pandemic. Okay. I haven't published that yet. But maybe, maybe 5 years later, like the Japanese wife story, when everybody has forgotten the pandemic will come as a story in my mind.
Well, now I leave it to the Augustus audience, if anybody, one question, because we have only left 5 minutes. Is there anybody to ask any question, please?
This was my first introduction to your fictional world, and I have started reading your latest book, In an Ideal World. I'm halfway through it. It certainly is very interesting, and I was just thinking about what you said in the inaugural address yesterday about the power of literature, about how literature can be relevant to our times, which are deeply divided on the one hand, but which also have a lot of distractions. And in that context, you said that journalism seems to be a better alternative for us, because it offers up to the moment an in-depth news, and literature seems to be falling behind the times. So your justification for literature was that it avoids the logjam. I like that expression that you used, that it avoids the logjam of the mind and directly appeals to the heart. Now, when I read this novel, which is basically trying to understand a very divided, ideologically torn landscape, political and also domestic, familial landscape, I have this question in my mind: how is it possible for literature to simply appeal to the heart unless literature also engages with these deep political, ideological questions? This is my
fair question. Look, my PhD was in the area of cognitive science. Okay, so I'll be the last person to say that there are deep phenomenological differences between the mind, the cognitive repository, and our emotional systems. Okay, obviously they're connected. Okay, and therefore I did not imply that literature or the arts ignore the thinking, the intellectual aspects of the reader, cast that aside, and appeals only to a certain kind of an emotion. I did not mean that, and that's not what cognitive science is as well. But whereas political commentary chooses the cognitive system as its primary target, okay, and then invades the heart, because remember, political ideologies can also arouse great emotional outbursts, okay, which you may like, which you may not like, okay. But the difference perhaps is that what literature and the arts do, it chooses as its primary target, appeals to the emotions, which then perhaps percolates through the cognitive system and influences the arguments that have been learned, and maybe helps to unlearn those arguments or even strengthen some of those arguments. Okay? I did not advocate a separation between the heart and the mind, because that would be foolish to do. That is not what our understanding of science suggests. I was suggesting a difference in terms of which particular aspect is prone towards instead of literary efforts and ventures. Okay. I certainly do want to influence the arguments with respect to the communal divide that we see in this country through this novel, but rather than write a treatise about that, I've chosen to write a novel about real people and the emotional dilemmas that they face.
Thank you, Kunal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kunal, for being here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
This program is sponsored and powered by Indian Oil and Coal India Limited. We sincerely thankful to our sponsors